One of the first signs that an empath is becoming truly dangerous is surprisingly subtle. It is not anger, it is not confrontation. It is not even confidence in the traditional sense. It is the moment they stop explaining themselves. For most of their lives, empaths feel a deep responsibility to make sure everyone understands their intentions. They explain because they care. They clarify because they value harmony. They spend enormous amounts of energy trying to ensure that no one feels hurt, confused, or left behind. If there is a misunderstanding, they rush to correct it. If someone questions their motives, they provide more context. If conflict arises, they become investigators, searching for the exact combination of words that will restore peace. At first glance, this seems like a strength. In many ways it is. The ability to consider another person's perspective is a rare quality. The willingness to communicate openly can build trust and connection. But there is a hidden danger that many empaths eventually discover. Not everyone is seeking understanding. Some people are seeking control. Some people have already decided who you are long before you begin explaining yourself. This realization changes everything. One of the most difficult lessons an empath learns is that clarity does not guarantee comprehension. You can explain your intentions perfectly and still be misunderstood. You can speak honestly and still be accused of dishonesty. You can offer your heart openly and still encounter suspicion, projection, and criticism. The younger version of the empath cannot accept this reality. They believe that if they simply find the right words, the right tone, the right explanation, everything will be resolved. So they continue trying. They write longer messages. They have longer conversations. They revisit old conflicts. They spend hours analyzing interactions that other people have already forgotten. What they do not realize is that every unnecessary explanation is often a negotiation of their own peace. Think about how much mental energy gets consumed when you constantly feel the need to defend who you are. Every misunderstanding becomes a case to argue. Every criticism becomes a puzzle to solve. Every judgment becomes something that must be corrected. Eventually, the empath reaches a breaking point, not because they become bitter, not because they stop caring, but because they finally recognize a truth that changes the way they see human behavior. People rarely see you exactly as you are. They see you through the lens of their experiences, fears, insecurities, expectations, and beliefs. A person who trusts easily may view your silence as calm confidence. A person who fears abandonment may interpret that same silence as rejection. A person who thrives on drama may see boundaries as hostility. The behavior is identical. The interpretation changes depending on the observer. This is where emotional maturity begins. The empath starts to understand that they are not responsible for managing every interpretation that others create. That realization feels liberating. For years, they carried the impossible burden of trying to control perceptions. They wanted everyone to understand their heart. They wanted everyone to see their intentions accurately. They wanted fairness. Then they discover something profound. Peace does not come from controlling how people see you. Peace comes from no longer needing to. This is where the transformation begins. The dangerous empath does not become louder. They become quieter. They stop participating in conversations designed to trap them in endless justification. They stop chasing people who have already decided to misunderstand them. They stop exhausting themselves, trying to gain approval from individuals who are committed to finding fault. Instead, they develop something far more powerful: discernment. Discernment allows them to recognize the difference between genuine curiosity and manipulation. It allows them to distinguish between a misunderstanding that deserves clarification and an accusation that deserves distance. When someone genuinely wants understanding, the empath will gladly communicate. When someone wants control, the empath simply steps back. This shift often surprises people. The same person who once explained everything suddenly becomes selective with their words. The same person who once fought tirelessly for every relationship begins protecting their energy. The same person who once feared disappointing others becomes comfortable with being misunderstood. To outsiders, this may appear cold. It is not coldness, it is wisdom. Because wisdom understands that not every battle deserves participation. One of the strongest psychological positions a person can occupy is the ability to remain centered when others misinterpret them. Most people react immediately. They defend, they argue, they justify. They attempt to regain control of the narrative. The evolved empath learns something different. They learn that their character speaks over time. Truth has patience. Integrity has patience. Authenticity has patience. When your actions consistently align with your values, you no longer feel compelled to provide a detailed defense for every accusation or misunderstanding that appears in your path. You trust reality to reveal itself. And that trust creates a form of quiet strength that many people find intimidating, because a person who no longer needs external validation becomes difficult to manipulate. A person who no longer fears being misunderstood becomes difficult to control. A person who values inner peace more than public approval becomes emotionally independent. That is why the most dangerous empath is often the calmest person in the room. They have learned that explaining themselves endlessly is not a sign of strength. It is often a sign of attachment to outcomes they cannot control. Now they understand the difference. They communicate when communication is useful. They clarify when clarification serves a purpose. And they walk away when neither will change anything. That is not giving up. That is growth. Because the moment you stop trying to convince everyone who you are, you finally gain the freedom to become who you were meant to be. Once an empath stops explaining themselves to everyone around them, something remarkable begins to happen. All of the energy that was once spent managing perceptions, defending intentions, and maintaining fragile relationships becomes available for something else. Observation. And observation is where real power begins. Most people assume that empaths are powerful because they feel deeply. That is only partially true. Feeling deeply is not a superpower by itself. In fact, without wisdom, it can become a liability. A person who feels everything but understands nothing is vulnerable to manipulation, exhaustion, and confusion. The dangerous empath emerges when sensitivity evolves into awareness. This transformation rarely happens through comfort. It almost always happens through pain. Betrayal teaches lessons that trust alone cannot teach. Disappointment reveals truths that optimism often hides. Heartbreak forces attention toward details that were once ignored. When people talk about becoming stronger, they often imagine becoming harder. But that is not what happens to the evolved empath. They do not become less sensitive. They become more perceptive. There is an important difference. The average person experiences emotional pain and immediately focuses on the event itself. The empath eventually learns to focus on the patterns behind the event. They begin asking different questions. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen to me?" they ask, "What did I fail to notice?" Instead of asking, "Why did this person hurt me?" they ask, "What signs were present before the damage occurred?" This shift changes everything, because life is filled with signals. Human beings are constantly communicating information beyond their words. Their behavior reveals priorities. Their reactions reveal insecurities. Their habits reveal intentions. Their treatment of others reveals character. The problem is that many empaths spend years overriding what they see, because they desperately want to believe the best in people. They notice inconsistencies, but explain them away. They recognize warning signs, but give endless second chances. They sense something is wrong, but convince themselves they are being judgmental. Over time, reality teaches a painful lesson. Intuition ignored eventually becomes experience, and experience is often a far more expensive teacher. After enough disappointment, the empath begins trusting their observations, not blindly, not emotionally, but intelligently. They start paying attention to patterns rather than promises. This is one of the most important psychological shifts a person can make. Anyone can make promises. Anyone can create explanations. Anyone can construct a convincing story. Patterns are different. Patterns are difficult to fake. A person's consistent behavior reveals far more than their intentions ever will. The dangerous empath learns to observe these patterns without becoming emotionally entangled in them. They stop focusing exclusively on what people say. They begin paying attention to timing, consistency, body language, actions under pressure, the way someone treats people who have nothing to offer them, the way they behave when they are frustrated challenged, or disappointed. This creates a form of psychological awareness that many people never develop. And the fascinating thing is that it often appears effortless. Someone enters the room, and the empath notices subtle tension in their posture. A conversation begins, and the empath detects a contradiction between words and emotions. A relationship develops, and the empath recognizes recurring behavioral patterns before anyone else sees them. This is not magic, it is accumulated observation. It is the result of thousands of experiences teaching the mind what to look for. Pain becomes data, disappointment becomes education, betrayal becomes training. What once wounded them now sharpens their perception. This is why healed empaths often seem unusually difficult to deceive. It is not because they assume everyone has bad intentions. Quite the opposite. Healthy awareness does not create paranoia. It creates clarity. The paranoid person expects danger everywhere. The aware person simply recognizes it when it appears. That distinction matters. Because many people misunderstand emotional intelligence. They assume emotional intelligence means being endlessly understanding and accepting. In reality, emotional intelligence also includes accurate judgment. It includes recognizing when compassion is appropriate and when caution is necessary. It includes understanding that empathy without discernment can become self-destruction. One of the greatest mistakes an empath can make is believing that understanding someone's pain requires tolerating their harmful behavior. Those are not the same thing. You can understand why someone acts a certain way and still refuse to participate in the consequences of their choices. You can have compassion for someone's struggles while maintaining firm boundaries. You can recognize another person's wounds without allowing those wounds to become your responsibility. This is where awareness becomes wisdom, because wisdom understands that insight is valuable only when it influences behavior. There is no benefit in recognizing manipulation if you continue accepting it. There is no benefit in identifying red flags if you consistently ignore them. There is no benefit in understanding human nature if that understanding never changes your decisions. The dangerous empath reaches a point where observation and action become aligned. When they notice disrespect, they respond accordingly. When they recognize deception, they adjust their trust. When they identify unhealthy patterns, they stop waiting for reality to become something it clearly is not. This creates a level of personal power that often surprises people. Others expect the empath to remain endlessly forgiving, endlessly available, endlessly accommodating. Instead, they encounter someone who sees clearly, someone who listens carefully, someone who notices what others miss, and someone who is no longer willing to abandon their own well-being for the comfort of others. That is why pain, when properly understood, becomes one of life's greatest teachers. Not because suffering itself is valuable, but because suffering can force awareness. And awareness, when combined with wisdom, becomes strength. The empath who once trusted too quickly now trusts intelligently. The empath who once ignored warning signs now recognizes them early. The empath who once saw only potential now sees reality. And reality, no matter how uncomfortable, is always the foundation of true power. Because the moment you stop looking at people through the lens of who you hope they will become, and start seeing them for who they consistently show themselves to be, your life changes forever. As awareness grows, another transformation begins to take place. It is quieter than most people expect, but it is far more significant than any external achievement. The empath slowly stops looking outside themselves for proof of their worth. This is one of the most difficult journeys a person can take, because the need for approval is deeply woven into human psychology. We are social creatures. From childhood, we learn to read faces, seek acceptance, and avoid rejection. Approval feels safe. Validation feels reassuring. Being appreciated feels rewarding. For the empath, however, this tendency often becomes amplified. Because empaths are naturally attuned to the emotions of others, they become highly skilled at noticing reactions. They notice approval. They notice disappointment. They notice subtle shifts in mood, tone, and expression. Over time, many begin measuring their value through those reactions without even realizing it. If people are happy, they feel successful. If people are upset, they feel responsible. If they receive praise, they feel secure. If they receive criticism, they question themselves. This creates a dangerous psychological trap. Their self-worth becomes dependent on variables they cannot control. Think about how exhausting that is. Imagine waking up every day and unconsciously allowing other people to determine how you feel about yourself. One person's approval lifts you up. Another person's disapproval pulls you down. A compliment creates confidence. A criticism creates doubt. That is not freedom. That is emotional dependencies disguised as kindness. Many empaths spend years trapped in this cycle because it appears virtuous on the surface. They call it caring. They call it being considerate. They call it putting others first. But beneath the surface, something else is happening. They are outsourcing their sense of value. And whenever your value depends on someone else's opinion, you become vulnerable to manipulation. This is why people-pleasing is so dangerous. Most people think people-pleasing is simply being nice. It is not. True kindness comes from choice. People-pleasing comes from fear, fear of rejection, fear of conflict, fear of disappointing others, fear of being misunderstood. As long as these fears remain in control, a person's behavior is no longer guided by principles. It becomes guided by approval. The empath starts making decisions based on how others might react, rather than what they know is right. They say yes when they want to say no. They tolerate disrespect to avoid confrontation. They remain in unhealthy relationships longer than they should. They suppress their own needs to maintain harmony. At first, this creates temporary peace, but eventually, it creates resentment. Because every time you abandon yourself to gain acceptance, a small part of you recognizes the compromise. The mind keeps score. You may convince everyone around you that you are happy, but internally something feels off. There is a growing sense that you are performing rather than living. The dangerous empath emerges when they finally confront this reality. They begin asking a powerful question: what happens if I stop trying to earn my worth? Most people never seriously consider that question, because they have spent their entire lives believing worth must be achieved. Achieve more. Please more people. Work harder. Be more attractive. Be more successful. Be more useful. The list never ends. Yet no matter how much external validation a person accumulates, it rarely creates lasting security. Why? Because external validation is temporary by nature. The same people who praise you today may criticize you tomorrow. The crowd that celebrates you can eventually forget you. Opinions change, trends change, circumstances change. If your confidence depends entirely on those changing factors, your confidence will always remain unstable. The empath eventually discovers a deeper truth. Self-worth is not something you earn. It is something you recognize. There is a profound difference between confidence and self-worth. Confidence is often connected to performance. Self-worth exists independently of performance. You can fail and still have worth. You can make mistakes and still have worth. You can disappoint people and still have worth. You can be misunderstood and still have worth. This realization creates enormous psychological freedom. Because once your value is no longer tied to constant approval, you stop living defensively. You stop managing every interaction as if your identity depends on the outcome. You stop chasing validation from people who are incapable of giving it. You stop viewing disagreement as a threat. Instead, you become grounded. And grounded people are difficult to control. Notice how many manipulative relationships operate through approval and disapproval. Approval becomes the reward. Disapproval becomes the punishment. As long as someone desperately needs validation, they remain vulnerable to this system. The evolved empath steps outside of it. They no longer need universal agreement. They no longer require constant reassurance. They no longer view criticism as evidence of inadequacy. This does not mean they ignore feedback. Quite the opposite. Emotionally mature people often welcome constructive feedback because their identity is no longer threatened by it. When your worth is secure, you can examine criticism objectively. If it is useful, you learn from it. If it is inaccurate, you release it. Either way, your sense of self remains intact. This is one of the clearest signs of genuine emotional strength. Not arrogance, not superiority, stability. A stable person does not need to convince everyone they are valuable. They already know. A stable person does not crumble when others disapprove. They listen, evaluate, and move forward. A stable person understands that being authentic will naturally attract some people and repel others, and they are at peace with that reality. The dangerous empath eventually reaches a point where they stop asking, "How do I get everyone to accept me?" And they begin asking, "Am I living alignment with my values?" That question changes everything. Because once your life becomes guided by values rather than validation, your decisions become clearer, your boundaries become stronger, your relationships become healthier, your confidence becomes real, and perhaps most importantly, your peace becomes independent of other people's opinions. That is the moment true self-respect is born. And when a person no longer needs approval to recognize their own worth, they become impossible to control through praise, impossible to weaken through criticism, and impossible to distract from the life they were meant to live. The day you stop asking others for permission to value yourself is the day your real power begins. Once an empath develops awareness and no longer depends on external validation to determine their worth, another transformation begins to unfold. This is often the stage that confuses people the most. Because from the outside, it can look like the empath has changed dramatically. Friends notice it, family notices it, former partners notice it. The empath who once carried everyone's emotional burdens suddenly seems lighter. The person who once rushed to rescue everyone becomes more selective. The individual who once absorbed every problem in the room begins maintaining distance from situations that would have consumed them in the past. Many people misunderstand this shift. They assume the empath has become cold, detached, or uncaring. In reality, the opposite is true. For the first time, they are learning the difference between compassion and responsibility. This distinction changes lives. One of the greatest challenges empaths face is that they often confuse understanding someone with becoming responsible for them. Because they can feel another person's pain so deeply, they naturally want to help. They see suffering and instinctively move toward it. They see confusion and want to provide clarity. They see struggle and want to ease the burden. These are beautiful qualities. But without boundaries, they become dangerous. Because there is a subtle psychological trap hidden within excessive empathy. When you repeatedly rescue people from the consequences of their choices, you begin interfering with their growth. Think about that carefully. Many empaths spend years believing they are helping, when in reality they are often preventing others from learning important lessons. Growth usually requires discomfort. Wisdom often requires consequences. Maturity develops through responsibility. When someone consistently avoids responsibility because another person keeps carrying the weight for them, development slows down. The empath eventually realizes something difficult. Not every problem is theirs to solve. Not every wound is theirs to heal. Not every crisis requires their involvement. At first, this realization feels uncomfortable because it challenges a deeply ingrained identity. Many empaths have spent years defining themselves through usefulness. They became the listener, the helper, the advisor, the emotional caretaker. And when your identity becomes tied to rescuing others, stepping back can feel selfish. But emotional maturity reveals a different truth. There is a difference between supporting someone and carrying them. Support empowers. Carrying creates dependency. The dangerous empath learns to recognize this distinction. They begin asking different questions. Instead of asking, "How can I fix this person's life?" they ask, "What responsibility belongs to me and what responsibility belongs to them?" That question creates clarity, because healthy relationships require ownership. Every person must carry their own emotional responsibilities. Every person must face the consequences of their choices. Every person must participate in their own growth. The empath can offer guidance. They can offer compassion. They can offer understanding. But they can no longer do the work for someone else. This is where emotional detachment enters the picture. Now, the word detachment often creates confusion because people associate it with indifference. They imagine someone who no longer cares, someone who shuts down emotionally, someone who withdraws from human connection. That is not emotional detachment. Emotional detachment, in its healthiest form, is the ability to remain compassionate without becoming consumed. It means caring without carrying. It means loving without losing yourself. It means helping without sacrificing your own well-being. This is one of the most powerful psychological skills a person can develop. Imagine being able to sit with someone in pain without absorbing that pain as your own. Imagine being able to support someone through a crisis without allowing their chaos to become your chaos. Imagine being able to love deeply while maintaining a strong sense of self. That is emotional mastery, and it requires a fundamental shift in perspective. The empath begins understanding that emotions are information, not commands. Just because you feel someone's suffering does not mean you must solve it. Just because you understand someone's pain does not mean you must tolerate harmful behavior. Just because you care about someone does not mean you must abandon yourself for them. This understanding creates extraordinary freedom, because many forms of manipulation rely on emotional overinvestment. Guilt becomes a weapon, pity becomes a tool, victimhood becomes leverage. The manipulative person understands that highly empathetic individuals often struggle to separate compassion from obligation. So they create situations designed to trigger guilt, responsibility, or fear. For years, the empath may fall into this pattern. They feel guilty for setting boundaries. They feel guilty for saying no. They feel guilty for prioritizing their own needs. But eventually, something changes. They recognize that guilt is not always evidence that they are doing something wrong. Sometimes guilt is simply evidence that they are doing something differently. And different feels uncomfortable before it feels natural. This realization allows them to establish healthier boundaries, not walls, boundaries. There is a difference. Walls keep everyone out. Boundaries determine who gets access and under what conditions. Healthy boundaries do not eliminate connection. They protect it. Because relationships built on obligation eventually collapse. Relationships built on mutual respect endure. The dangerous empath understands this. They stop trying to save people who are committed to self-destruction. They stop arguing with people who are committed to misunderstanding them. They stop investing enormous amounts of energy into relationships that consistently produce exhaustion rather than growth. Instead, they become intentional. Their compassion becomes more focused. Their energy becomes more protected. Their relationships become more reciprocal. And something remarkable happens. The quality of their connections improves. Why? Because people begin relating to them from a place of respect rather than dependency. They are no longer available for emotional exploitation. They are no longer controlled by guilt. They are no longer driven by the need to rescue everyone around them. What remains is something far stronger than endless sacrifice. Wisdom. The wisdom to know when to help. The wisdom to know when to step back. The wisdom to understand that every person must ultimately walk their own path. This is not a loss of empathy. It is the evolution of empathy. It is empathy guided by discernment. Compassion strengthened by boundaries. Love supported by self-respect. And when an empath reaches this stage, they become extraordinarily powerful. Not because they care less, but because they finally understand that caring for others should never require abandoning themselves. The moment you learn to care deeply without carrying what was never yours to carry, your compassion stops being a weakness and becomes a force. After all of these transformations, after the empath has stopped explaining themselves, sharpened their awareness, detached their worth from approval, and learned the art of emotional boundaries, there is one final evolution that completes the process. It is the ability to walk away, not dramatically, not with anger, not with a desire for revenge, simply with certainty. This is the point where the most dangerous empath emerges, because they have overcome one of the strongest forces in human psychology, the fear of loss. For years, many empaths remain trapped in situations that no longer serve them because they are deeply attached to potential. They see who a person could become. They see what a relationship might be. They see the possibility hidden beneath the reality. And while hope can be a beautiful thing, it can also become a prison. Because when you become attached to potential, you stop evaluating reality accurately. You begin loving possibilities more than facts. You begin investing in promises more than patterns. You begin waiting for change instead of responding to what consistently exists. The empath often stays longer than most people would, They give second chances, then third chances, then 10th chances. They keep searching for explanations that justify behavior. They keep finding reasons to remain patient. They keep convincing themselves that one more conversation, one more effort, one more sacrifice might finally create the breakthrough they have been hoping for. Sometimes it does. Most of the time, it does not. Eventually, reality becomes impossible to ignore. The empath realizes that there is a profound difference between helping someone grow and waiting indefinitely for them to become someone else. That realization creates a shift in perspective. They stop asking, "What could this become?" And they begin asking, "What is this right now?" That question changes everything, because reality has a way of simplifying decisions. When you look at what is actually happening, rather than what you hope will happen, clarity appears. You no longer evaluate relationships based on intentions alone. You evaluate them based on outcomes. You no longer focus exclusively on words. You focus on actions. You no longer measure people by isolated moments. You measure them by consistent patterns. This clarity often leads to a difficult conclusion. Some people are not meant to continue the journey with you. That truth can be painful because empaths value connection deeply. They remember the good moments. They remember the shared experiences. They remember the promises. They remember the version of the relationship that once existed. And because of that, leaving often feels like betrayal. But emotional maturity introduces a different understanding. Leaving is not betrayal when staying requires self-betrayal. Read that again. Many people spend years abandoning themselves in order to avoid abandoning others. They tolerate disrespect. They accept manipulation. They ignore exhaustion. They sacrifice peace, all because they fear what will happen if they finally let go. But there comes a point when remaining becomes more damaging than leaving. The dangerous empath recognizes that point. And when they do, they make a decision that surprises everyone around them. They stop negotiating with reality. One of the most fascinating aspects of human behavior is our tendency to seek closure. We want explanations. We want apologies. We want understanding. We want the story to end neatly. The empath is especially vulnerable to this because they naturally seek meaning. When something painful happens, they want to understand why. When a relationship ends, they want answers. When trust is broken, they want clarity. But life does not always provide these things. Sometimes the apology never comes. Sometimes the explanation never arrives. Sometimes the person responsible never acknowledges the damage they caused. And this is where many people become trapped. They postpone their healing while waiting for closure. They convince themselves they cannot move forward until they receive answers. The evolved empath discovers a difficult but liberating truth. Closure is not something another person gives you. Closure is something you create. It is the decision to stop waiting, the decision to stop chasing, the decision to stop reopening wounds in search of explanations, the decision to accept what happened without needing it to be different. This acceptance is not weakness. It is one of the highest forms of strength, because acceptance allows movement. Resistance creates stagnation. The dangerous empath understands that every minute spent chasing closure from wrong people is a minute stolen from building a better future. So they stop chasing. They stop pursuing those who have already shown disinterest. They stop trying to convince people to value them. They stop trying to earn love that should have been freely given. And something remarkable happens. Their energy returns. The energy once spent holding on to unhealthy attachments becomes available for growth, for purpose, for meaningful relationships, for personal development, for peace. This is why the ability to walk away is so powerful. It is not about rejection. It is about self-respect. It is not about giving up. It is about recognizing when continued investment no longer serves a meaningful purpose. It is not about becoming cold. It is about becoming clear. The most dangerous empath does not threaten to leave. They do not create ultimatums. They do not seek attention through absence. When they leave because they have already completed the internal work. They have already observed the patterns. They have already communicated their concerns. They have already offered opportunities for growth. And they have already accepted the reality in front of them. By the time they walk away physically, they have often walked away emotionally long before. This is what makes their departure so final. Not anger, not resentment, certainty. Because certainty requires no performance. It requires no explanation. It requires no audience. It simply moves forward. And that is the final lesson of the dangerous empath. Their greatest power was never their sensitivity, their intuition, or even their ability to understand others. Their greatest power is their willingness to choose peace over attachment, truth over illusion, and self-respect over emotional dependence. The moment you stop fearing what you might lose, you finally become free to build the life you deserve.